Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. It's so wonderful to see everyone filling the auditorium today. Of course, the students, really wonderful to see so many people who have crossed paths with George professionally and academically. So many of our friends from the community are here. So that's super exciting. Before I start the program, I do need to start with a few thank yous. First and foremost, I need to thank John Paponis, who accepted my invitation to lead organizing the special event today. I also want to thank Elisa Dionisi and Harris Dimitropoulos, who were part of the preparatory discussions around shaping the agenda for this event. Thanks to also everyone who helps behind the scenes. And there's so many things that happen behind the scenes to put an event like this together. So in the College of Design, there's Amy Forson, there's Anna Hovel, Blake Clayton, Andre Ogden. In the School of Architecture, it's Audrey Childs and Tynita Brown. I'm sure I'm going to forget somebody. I don't mean to, so please don't hold this against me. And then also to our terrific student team who help patiently with any kind of AV support, with the AIA learning credits, sign in, and really probably so much more that I'm not even aware of that they do to help us put together events like this. So speaking of the AIA credits, we do have a sign-in sheet out in the lobby. This event was submitted for approval. It's still pending review. I'm pretty sure probably the weather impacted that review process like it impacted everything else this week. But please go ahead if you'd like to get AIA learning credits, sign in, and the hope is that we'll be able to retroactively log the hours for this event. And then finally, I want to thank Dean Bassett, whose idea it was to host this event for George Johnston. So I'm delighted to welcome you all to Who is the Architect? Through these presentations and discussions, the things that we're going to talk about will be around the changing forms and formats of architectural practice. We're going to talk about it in light of social, environmental, and technological concerns, and how these are challenging what we might see as old boundaries of the professional agency and disciplinary expertise. The symposium brings together 4 scholars today. First, I'm going to say their names in alphabetical order, which is different than what they're showing on the screen there. But Phil Bernstein, Deputy Dean and Professor of Architecture at Yale University. Aaron Cayer from Assistant Professor at Cal Poly Pomona. Elizabeth Cristoforetti, Assistant Professor in the Practice of Architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And then, of course, George Johnston, Professor Emeritus here at Georgia Tech and the scholar in whose honor the symposium is organized. So just some introductions to explain who our guests are. Phil is, as I have mentioned, the Deputy Dean and Adjunct Professor at Yale University. He teaches courses in professional practice, in project delivery, and in technology. He is a former vice president at Autodesk, where he was responsible for setting the company's vision and strategy for technology. Prior to joining Autodesk, Phil practiced as an associate principal at Caesar Pelli's office. So he's had kind of a really rich and broad background of expertise. He writes extensively on issues of practice and technology, including architecture, design, and data, practice competency in the era of computation, machine learning. This is a more recent book, Machine Learning and Architectural Futures in the Era of Artificial Intelligence. Phil is a member, a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. He received his Bachelor of Arts and his Master of Architecture from Yale. Aaron Cayer is an assistant professor at Cal Poly Pomona. His research and teaching and service focus on the history and theory of architecture firms, the profession, and political economies. He is currently finishing his first book. It's entitled From A to AECOM, Architecture Practice and the Twilight of Professional Tradition. I'm looking forward to when that comes out. I'm adding that to my bookshelf. Outside of the Academy, he's been an active member of the Architecture Lobby since 2015, and he served as the lobby's National Content Coordinator in 2020. Aaron received his PhD in architecture history from UCLA, and then he received his undergraduate and graduate degrees in architecture from Norwich University in Vermont. Elizabeth Cristoforetti, her teaching and research that focuses on emerging modes of design practice in the built environment. Her work at the GSD explores design methods, theories, and the technological building blocks that enable design practice to better confront the imperatives of our time, such as artificial intelligence and market-driven urbanism. Her research group within the Laboratory of Design Technologies aims to uncover the potentials for scalable systems of design by daylighting, operating upon, and designing new socio-technical systems. She also runs a practice, Supernormal. This is a design studio based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And she treats her practice as an engaged design practice that meets the world exactly as it is. And that is, as she puts it, a glass that is half full. Elizabeth received her Bachelor of Arts in Religion and Visual Arts from Bowdoin College and a Master of Architecture from the GSD. George Johnston has 40 years of experience as an architect, educator, academic leader, and cultural historian, and currently as a principal of Johnston and Dumais Architects, in brackets. Born in Mississippi, a native of Eden, he was raised in the Delta between the woods and the road. I love George's bio. He worked as a historic building surveyor for the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. He's worked in architectural practices in Mississippi, in Texas, and in Georgia. George received his PhD in American Cultural History from Emory University. He received his MArch from Rice University, a BArch from Mississippi State University. Let me see, did I get all the degrees in there, George? I think I got them all. He is currently Professor Emeritus here at Georgia Tech, where he has taught courses in architectural and urban design, cultural theory, and the social history of architectural practice. His most recent book, Assembling the Architect, The History and the Theory of Professional Practice, is, I think in a way, forms the background for what we're going to talk about today, and the essay that he contributed to the Harvard Design Magazine, Who is the Architect? All right, so we got some great heavy hitters here with us today. So last week we met on Teams to run through the, it was myself, the three guests, George and John. We met on Teams to run through some thoughts about today and where we thought this conversation might lead. The conversation that day, it was humorous, it was provocative, it was critical, and it was sharp. And if it's any indication of the conversation that will happen this afternoon following the presentations, you're really going to be in for a stimulating afternoon. You're going to hear about the changing forms and formats of practice. You will need to prepare yourself to be challenged about the assumptions of what defines practice today in the field of architecture, the discipline, and also the profession. So here is how the afternoon will go. After I exit the stage, John Paponis will share opening remarks, and he's going to set the stage for the program. After which each of the guests will come up to the stage in this order: Elizabeth, then Aaron, and then Phil. And then after the presentations, George will come to the stage and offer a response. And then after that, I will moderate a panel discussion with our four speakers, and this will be followed by questions from all of you. And at the end of the symposium, I'd like to invite you to please join us for a reception just up the stairs in the Cohen Gallery. So with that, please join me in welcoming John Paponis to the stage.
I'm certainly not able to even begin to address the question, who is the architect? And I'm happy that we have our distinguished guests to do that. And I'm not even particularly able to answer the question, who is George Johnston? For many of us, he's the indispensable presence for the administrative well-being of the school. He's been at Georgia Tech for 40 years. 14 of these years he held administrative positions. He was the first chair of the School of Architecture when architecture was formed as a school in 2010. And as far as I can remember, he's been the go-to person for every administrator since I've joined Georgia Tech in 1989. For others, George is the teacher whose influence and whose formative influence on people gets felt a long time after graduation and is often acknowledged in this way. For some lucky people, George is a very generous host, and I must say also a great cook. And for the luckier ones amongst us, he's a very reliable friend.
Great. Hi. Thank you so much to Julie and John and George for the occasion to have me here. I'm really honored to be part of this, especially since it is in George's honor. George, your body of work is remarkable. And I know my colleague Jacob and I talk about it all the time. I'm getting some feedback here. It's okay. And your work at History truly allows the present to be more legible, and I think actually our future more hopeful. So it is a gift, and thank you. All right. So along with my colleague Jacob, who I just mentioned, I guest edited this past issue of the Harvard Design Magazine. Jacob and I have been working on this for a number of years. George contributed the first piece in the issue, and Phil and Aaron also contributed. So George's piece is entitled, as the symposium is, Who is the Architect? It kicks off the issue. And I'm going to be using the issue as sort of a device as I go through to talk about some of the pieces on the table today. So the issue came out of a research seminar that I'd been running since 2020. It was called The Products of Practice. And the goal of the course and the related research was to really use the lens of history and theory to better understand how the shifting nature of architectural instrumentation limits, expands, or even fundamentally changes the agency of the architect and the relevance of the architect in society. In both the magazine and the course, instruments of service is meant literally. It is the things that we make as architects, from drawings to models to even the profession itself, but is also taken to be, and it's also meant as a metaphor. So in that sense, the role of the architect actually, we as architects are instruments of service to society. And so that's a kind of big piece of the reflection today, I think. The architect will be explored as an instrument of service, as I said, to society, driven by a set of values that are native to the time and place we live. So this idea of the architect as a temporal construct, which George has really beautifully teed up, I think is quite important. All right. So I just learned, I was asking George right before I came up here, if he had chosen this painting by John Gast. I think it's perfectly chosen. It's a painting called American Progress from 1872, and it's a very vivid allegorical representation of manifest destiny and the values that drove that moment forward. So the goddess like Columbia is the spirit of American aspirations and identity. And as she moves west across the dark wilderness of the unconquered American landscape, she brings with her here the light of intellect, industry, and societal progress, right? And this is a pretty excellent illustration of the industrial era paradigm of growth. Columbia, as we can see, is sort of serenely connecting the landscape with the telegraph lines that she's pulling along behind her, and the railroads as the wildlife and native peoples flee. The escalating imperatives of our time, namely the intersecting complexities of climate crisis, digitalization, which is hard to say, and social inequity, are the direct outcome of the worldview presented in this tableau. This is the culture from which our profession and its regulating frameworks emerged. So the modern idea of the architect is a bit bound up in the values of, or a lot bound up in the values of a different time, and one that is built on the paradigm of infinite growth in a finite world. So I'll take a look at this question of who is the architect in 3 short acts from the outside in. So what are the external pressures that are formed out of the ambitions on the previous slide that are pressurizing our field? And from the inside out, the core knowledge and expertise. And then finally, in relationship to, this is a quote from George's piece, what we may make next. Hopefully that'll provide some useful conversation for our later discussion. So it feels important to just say out loud the imperatives of our time, the inherited environmental, social, and technological legacies of industrialization and modernism. They are vast and overwhelming. Architecture is torn between diverging commitments. On one hand, to make the world better, let's say not to amplify climate change, for instance, and on the other, to increase capital for our clients by building more, and of course, thereby adding flame to the fire of climate change. Because the modern profession is built upon a paradigm of limitless growth, it's not especially clear how the field can act without either ethical or financial self-destruction. Not an especially rosy picture, I suppose. So traditionally, we operate as architects over here. This is a diagram I show in my classes, and I thought it would be helpful here. This is the project scale. We operate over here. But this is what our professional ethics kind of want us to operate on, right? We want to make society better. We want to do good things for the world. But these are the things, the mediating infrastructures that we need to operate through. So these constructs of power in the middle that we serve, that mediate the agency of design, are the capital stacks, technology stacks, and let's say the policy frameworks of the world. As George noted in his article, architects act as handmaidens of these interests, either because they pay us directly or because they are the regulatory, technological, and financial gatekeepers that determine the constraints for design apart from our larger goal of cultural production. Another piece in the issue here by Matthew Sewells. These constraints are growing in quantity, severity, and complexity. This piece gets at practices of designing for 21st century financialization in a time when buildings have become a serious class of assets in the global market. As such, our clients require predictable and repeatable returns, which in turn drives design practice towards systematization, commodification, and scale. And as a side, but I think important note, when the post-recession market kind of gangs together with ballooning regulation and extended public processes, the distinction between architecture with a capital A and building more generally begins to collapse under the weight of externalities, causing chaos for the intellectual project of the architect and a bit of an identity crisis for the architect. So the technological context for design, another essential externality, also provides a not insignificant, if I think probably less understood, pressure. As a society, we are shifting from practices of digitization, which is the way that we gradually convert analog information into a digital format, to life in an era of digitalization, in which the quantity and structure of digital information are sufficiently robust to enable a fundamental transformation in the socio-technical processes and systems that define and drive professional practices and the public and private sector operations more generally. So an example of this, maybe a helpful analog, is the shift from, let's say, VHS to Netflix. So it's not just a shift from the physical artifact of the tape to a digital file. There's also a fundamental change in the model of media distribution and consumption. The act of digitizing entertainment allowed for a conversion of the entire media industry from the rental of a product into an environment of automated personalization, subscriptions, and networked curation based on preference. Although it has an impact, certainly on the level of human experience in urban form, digitalization is fundamentally a systems level problem, and one that we do not yet fully understand in relationship to our own fields. However, we do see early indications that digitalization is calling our professional purpose and expertise into question. This is a really fascinating conversation between the economist Daniel Susskind and the presidents of the AIA, the AMA, the American Medical Association, and the ABA, the American Bar Association, that was part of the issue, moderated by Jeffrey Burchard. And it really, it was a terrifically fascinating conversation to be a fly on the wall in. What it really shows is that we're all concerned about the same things. The same conversations that we're having in our field are the same ones that are happening in law and medicine. We focused a bit on artificial intelligence and asked what was happening. And I think what we heard was that there's a fear of diminishing. There was both this kind of concern about like what will happen when expertise gets democratized. And on the other hand, there's an enormous amount of hope that artificial intelligence may allow us to better fulfill the services we promise to society. The data that represents architecture is more difficult to systematize than text and numerical data. Buildings are not quite as easy, right? Our drawings, this is more difficult and diverse data. It leaves our field a little bit behind of law and medicine in this conversation, but it seems reasonable to consider the changing skills required to do our work in an era of digitalization, and even more importantly, as the values that we will ultimately serve as we systematize and automate our human experience. So this is a little bit of visual data, and it is actually quantitative as well, I don't know, maybe back up the haze of complexity that I've put on the table so far around these external pressures. This is, Jacob and I did this study of the buildings on the Harvard campus through the years. This is looking at academics buildings that were designed and built for Harvard since the 18th century. And what you see in white at the bottom, these little white squares, what did I do? Clicker there. These little white squares are the number of documents in the construction document set. So you have, Bullfinch over here with like 10, and then you've got H.H. Richardson with about double. Once you get to our Gund Hall over here in the 1960s, you're at, dozens. And most recently, there's an engineering building by Banish over there that's almost 1,000. So the complexity is actually quantifiable and quite real. So the visual story is clear, grappling with things like energy efficiency, the rise of the general contractor and industrialized building components, digitization and increasing regulation and liability makes for significantly more complicated buildings. They require ballooning numbers of consultants and increasing need for specialization within the field. A similar story is told in some other documentation with specifications and contracts and models, which are now, of course, a collaboration between not just architects, but all of our consultants as well. We don't even write the specifications anymore, right? So it's real. Okay. All right. So the field is growing in complexity and forcing the architect to confront our relationship with society and ourselves in new and yet unknown ways. So we'll take now the inside out. I can get the slide to change. There we go. Okay. All right. So these are three distinct but related frameworks that influence what we make and who we become as architects. The practice, the profession, and the discipline of architecture cultivate, reflect, and amplify the value systems of our time in different ways and to different degrees. And I think it's important to kind of draw this distinction. I find it personally very clarifying. The practice of designing buildings in urban form is ancient, it's enduring, it's global, it's continuously changing endeavor that is highly responsive to changes in politics and economic structures and technology. The profession of architecture is actually relatively new in the larger scope of human history. It is a fundamentally local thing that is bound by geographic and political limits of licensure. It's subject to the regulatory infrastructure and the constructed values of a state, a specific state or nation. The discipline of architecture, as we know it here in the US, is a body of cultural and theoretical knowledge emerging from the specific context of the European Renaissance and the value system of American settlement. It defines architecture as an intellectual pursuit and prepares designers for practice in the world. So these three frameworks are supposed to be working together, right? And they often work together, and then sometimes they're also at odds. Our current environment of crisis and complexity daylights a few conflicts between the discipline and the profession in particular, which I want to say a few words about. So a structural push towards professionalization and specialization poses a challenge to some degree for the intellectual project of architecture, amplifying the tension between the discipline and the profession. While the profession is trending towards consolidation and collaboration, the discipline remains aligned in support of small cultural practices and individual authorship. Additionally, the number of PhDs in architecture, and actually I think we could say all specialized degrees that are related, has increased significantly over the past 2 decades, reflecting the demand for specialization, but also a separation between architecture as a professional degree, as a profession, and as an intellectual pursuit. So it's increasingly unclear where people like me with a professional degree can contribute to the intellectual project of architecture outside of our universities. Where do we get to write? How do we get to play a part, right? The relevance of the discipline to the profession and to everyday practice, as well as society at large, also requires some clarification. Meanwhile, the practice of designing buildings, sort of generally in the world, remains agile and agnostic to the discipline and the profession. It's not really worried about the other two so much. It's just going to keep on going. It will simply reshape itself to absorb change, while the aging profession is growing brittle due to the accumulation of path dependencies around the regulating norms and general resistance to change. It's a thing. It's also worth noting that none of these things are actually suffering. All three of these, the discipline, the practice, and the profession, they are growing. The number and the bounded territory of graduate degrees is growing explosively, in fact. And according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the year-over-year growth of the profession is outpacing other industries in a significant way. And it turns out like we're having a good moment with our asset class, and it does pay. And practice, ever endeavors to generate new and better technologies and mechanics to construct our built environment with or without the help of the discipline and the profession. But I want to say, I'm not sure, and maybe this gets to the crux of the issue, I'm not sure that growth is the best metric that we have. I'm not sure that it is, it's the best way to measure positive change. So maybe this is something we can take up later. All right, so finally, I certainly do not have an answer to, what the architect may make and may become, or even who the architect is. But it seems reasonable to make a few educated speculations about the nature of practice in the near future based upon what we can observe in the wild. So this is what I had mentioned before. This is maybe the pressurization from the inside, the discipline, the practice, and the profession. And at the same time, here are all the things that are pushing from the outside in, all of the worldly imperatives. So the architect is caught negotiating numerous and divergent value systems, which cannot be perfectly mediated. Producing more stuff, which is, we produce the ideas for the stuff. It amplifies the problematic paradigm of infinite growth in our finite world. But this is, of course, how we make money and culture and how the profession grows. We have a professional responsibility to society to prioritize the public health, safety, and welfare of our society. But our work is responsible for 40% of the world's carbon emissions, which obviously flies in the face of this duty. The complexity that results inevitably calls into question our role and identity within society. And while this paints a somewhat blurry picture of the architect as an elastic and expanding constellation, did I skip there we go. So I made this diagram. I'm calling it the landscape of practice. And the general idea here is that history tells us that fields shift, destabilize, and morph in the face of contextual complexity. And our moment is not likely to be an exception. So this is what this landscape diagram says here. So these are all the kind of territories of practice. Here's professional practice at the center, kind of mapped it. Like if you do small stuff, you're over here. If you do big stuff, you're over here. If the things that you make are scalable, they can happen more than once because you want them to be profitable or maybe more impactful in some way. You might be up here. And if they're one-off, they're down here. And even the lines that I've drawn are too neat. This is a kind of blurry and multifaceted thing. It is certainly a territory of, the picture here is not only of an expanding and elastic field, but of the architect kind of as a multi-headed beast with many dynamic roles in the world. There we go. All right, so maybe that paints a little bit of a blurry picture about the things we might do as an architect and who we might be, but I think we could say something more in an illuminating way by pointing to the object of our attention, which is building an urban form. So the idea or nature of architecture itself is changing, and this means that the skills and interest required to make architecture are also changing. This is the sheet from the construction documents of House Zero. This is a lab at the GSD that's testing the use of automated systems and data flowing in and out of the digital landscape beyond the walls of the house, really with the goal to lower the carbon footprint. So this is, this is a smart home with the express interest of reducing energy usage. And this is, of course, a pretty far cry from the primitive hut. It's a kind of inside-out Baroque kind of thing, an elaborate and technologically ornate set of systems hidden behind walls and ceiling panels that are continuously collecting and responding to data within and beyond the walls. It's really important to note, as this book on the right discusses, though it's not from the field of architecture, it's from the field of product. The building is no longer a static artifact. It's rather an interconnected set of systems that dissolve boundaries between digital and physical experience of a space. The building itself here actually becomes an actor with independent agency to make change. And just to be very, very clear, this means that once the architect walks away from the building continues to change, and the design, in a way, continues to change beyond it, which is kind of a remarkable thing. It has a capacity to change over hours, days, and seasons. And what it really ends up becoming is a kind of loosely bounded set of human and non-human systems within the envelope of this building. So this requires the design of not only the building itself, but of the invisible systems and processes as well. Things that we might not usually recognize as architecture, which changes the skill sets required to design in a significant and meaningful way, calling into question even further what this thing of the architect is. So in this case, the architect actually needs to also be a systems engineer, or at the very least, a human-computer interaction specialist. And I mean, this is our, since the Renaissance, this is kind of what we've been doing, no? I mean, there's an architect who's knowledgeable, who's making some things into the design process. They learn things, and then they design and plan a building, and they give instructions to a builder. Yeah, and then we make a building. That's it. But this is what we're doing now, and it's very, very different. Yes, there's still an architect. Yes, we're in this room. We're still talking about these things and see what AI says about it. But we're also working with communities, consultants, collaborators. We have to think about human-to-human relationships and human-to-machine relationships. Our collaborations are growing in both quality and quantity, and the things that we're making are of a very different ilk than they once were. So, it requires a kind of reorientation to the building as an object of our attention, as well as the processes by which we design. I think it's possible that we might also need to think about how our buildings are becoming less autonomous, both literally and conceptually, as we struggle with the ethical imperative to move beyond the scale of the project. So if we're trying to operate up here, we really need to think about how interconnected we are to other things. I would go so far to say that the project of autonomy feels increasingly conservative and apologetic in this sense. So to confront the challenges of our time, the architect must not only take call. So in a way, what I'm suggesting here is that if we want to really do this, we can't only continue to operate down here at the project. We actually need to start pushing up and making things happen on these levels too, right? And that's a very, very different model than the current professional practice model. That requires a different business model, actually, to some extent. So the idea here being that we have to continue to operate on the artifact, but also its entangled social, technological, and biological systems. This was supposed to be a GIF. Imagine that there is a pendulum swinging back and forth. I converted this to a PDF and it got messed up. All right. Increasingly, a core competence of the architect is the capacity to hold and process multiple and even seemingly divergent narratives. As the nature of both the systems that shape architecture and the DNA of architecture itself change, the architect is riding a pendulum that continuously swings between idealism and the sort of, I would say, the idealism of modernism, right? So this kind of idea that there is something shared, there's a shared project, we can get together and we can do this and we can solve a problem. And then on the other hand, the kind of ironic playfulness and the friction-filled idiosyncrasies of postmodernism, which are the meaningful inefficiencies of what it is to be human. We have to be able to hold both of these things at the same time. And maybe that's, in a way, I think possibly one of the most significant values that we have to society. So hopefully this frames up a useful conversation in some way as we assess the condition of the architect and our changing relationship with society. While the identity of the architect as the heroic author of the built environment is arguably fading, the notion of the architect as a group of actors with a set of shared values together imagining a meaningful future for our built environment is kind of coming together in a way. This kind of architect almost certainly operates from a position of critical optimism and can choose to participate in the project of the built environment in numerous ways. The challenge then is agreement upon a value system befitting the 21st century. Only then can we speculate upon the structural potentials of practice and understand the disposition of an architect that is truly relevant to our time. So that is that. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. Are we live? Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, John and Julie, for this kind invitation. George and I met on a panel 8 years ago at ACSA on a panel titled The Design of Practice. And we have continued sort of parallel lines of thought ever since. So I'm really grateful to be here to celebrate George, to honor George, as he prefers. So I'm going to talk today about one small part of a book that I have just finished about the history of corporate architecture firms. In it, I trace the history of one architecture firm now known as AECOM. From its beginning as a 3-person architecture partnership to its current position as a massive multinational corporate conglomerate. But before diving in, I thought I would begin by sharing a little bit about how and why I became interested in AECOM in the first place. So I moved to Los Angeles in 2012 after finishing architecture school, after learning that architects didn't make a whole lot of money, and that most worked in small firms of less than 20 people. And I was still very confused about the profession and the role of the architect. And as I was walking through downtown LA for the first time, I was looking up and reading the business names affixed to the tops of the tallest towers. One stood out. I read Union Bank, US Bank, City National Bank, Open Bank, and then AECOM. And I thought, what is AECOM? So I went home and I browsed their website, and the firm was a Fortune 500 engineering and architecture company with more revenue than any other publicly traded company in LA at the time, rivaled only by Disney next door in Burbank. So for scale comparisons, the firm itself held more capital than 97 countries worldwide. It rented offices in as many nations as the UN. And with nearly 100,000 employees, more people work there than live in 98% of American cities. Just for further context, the chief executive officer earned $15.6 million that year alone. And so I began to wonder, like other critics at the time, how had AECOM become so big, yet so quietly embedded in a sea of financial institutions? Who were the architects? What did they do there? And how did this definition of architect, how had it come to be? So AECOM listed 28 services across nearly 50 subsidiary firms on its website: architecture and design, IT and cybersecurity, finance, Strategy plus, what didn't the company do? I kept asking myself. In one division of the firm, architects had recently designed a new headquarters for the LA Police Department. In a second division, architects were helping to train Afghans for combat. In yet another, architects were writing the legal code of a part of a new master plan for Kigali in Rwanda. So how and why were architects involved in these radically different muscles of colonial governance? Who were the people? The business leaders, the politicians, engineers, and architects working and making the decisions within the firm. And how were they influencing the role of the architect and the profession more broadly? So without getting too much into the details today, it turns out that AECOM was the product of an architecture firm that formed in 1946, immediately following World War II, known as Daniel, Mann, Johnston, and Mendenhall Architects, better known as DIMJIM. And its history parallels the history of many architecture firms over the span of the 20th century. So Albert Kahn's firm, for example, or Perkins and Will. The firm later became known for its military projects, both in the US and abroad during the 1960s, including the nation's first underground intercontinental ballistic missile program. Just as a fun aside, the rendering on the right was designed by an architect collaborator, Jack Martin Smith, who went to school with all of the founders, and also did the rendering for the Wizard of Oz, Emerald City. When you look at the two side by side, they sort of look a bit similar. You'll never see Emerald City in the same way again. But later, massive infrastructure in city planning projects in the 1970s and 80s. Here's a wastewater treatment plant that was designed in the 70s and built in the 80s. And on the right, a housing complex that was proposed by DIMJIM architects Cesar Pelli and Anthony Lumsden, which was never built. But the firm did not have immediate success. In its first 3 years, the founding architects were focusing only on the design of school buildings, and they were nearly bankrupt. They were taking turns in the hospital due to stress-induced stomach ulcers, and they were blaming each other for the firm's inability to make a profit. So in 1950, they called in the experts. They hired a management consulting firm named Booz Allen and Hamilton to help them organize their firm and gain financial traction. The leading consultant found work on business details left unattended, and bills uncollected. And so he recommended two things. First, that they shouldn't be focused only on school buildings, that they should diversify their project types, like thinking about military and international development projects, which offered higher fees. And second, that they should become a corporation rather than a partnership. So DIMJIM filed its articles of incorporation in 1952, creating several organization charts like this one to structure their own growth. And at the time, the government was permitting only architects working on government projects abroad to be corporations because they were working on big and risky projects, so deserved greater legal protections. And that also came with better tax benefits than partnerships. So corporations became synonymous with higher profit, expansion, collaboration, and protection. And today, as many of you likely know, corporations are the most common type of architecture practice today in the US. And you can see here how they've surpassed both sole proprietorships and partnerships in the 1970s. And over the same span of time, large firms with more than 100 people began to command the field's billings, even though they represented and still do represent only 1% of all firms in the US. But as a corporation, you're also able to acquire other companies to diversify your offerings or to expand your geographic breadth, or project types. And so as new expertise was needed, entire companies and their assets were acquired or swapped through stocks rather than merely hiring a chief laborer. So by the 1970s, DimGim acquired and merged with a diverse array of firms, and it was described as a professional conglomerate, a firm as a portfolio. In other words, a firm with many firms within it. And here you can see a list of all of the firms that were swallowed up or merged with or developed by DimGim since the 1950s. And so quickly, what were some of the quote, subsidiary firms at DimGim? Two of their earliest subsidiary organizations were Logicomp and Design Methods, which were early data processing organizations. Using their military contracts, they had access to military computers. So a UNIVAC 1108 and a UNIVAC 9300, which is what you see on the right. When I first looked at these images, I thought that was a washing machine. But no, they are computers. The UNIVAC 1108 in particular was developed as a multiprocessor for guiding ballistic missiles. And it cost about $2.3 million at the time. So it was really impossible for a typical architecture firm to have one, but they at least had access. A second subsidiary was DimGim Aerial. They acquired a military bomber, an A-26 from World War II, as most architects do. And they used the Huron equipment, which is equipment used for navigating bombers, to survey, quote, undeveloped and unknown parts of the world, including in Africa and South America. They also conducted surveillance missions for the Air Force, but this practice was, of course, scrubbed from historical record. And so with all of these many subsidiaries within this expanding corporate conglomeration, from real estate to construction management to surveillance to even cosmic X-rays, the urban economy itself was defined as the site for the architect. So the city, like the firm, was comprised of social, economic, political, and physical subsystems. But the architects were actively engaged not only in architecture, but in every subsystem through technology, finance, and transportation, and communications. So if we flash forward to more recent days to help us answer the question about who is an architect, we can turn to the words of corporate leaders for hints that echo the history we've just covered. AECOM's vice president argued in 2010 that we are AECOM. We can do anything. Across town at Gensler, another architect more recently suggested that their architecture is, quote, what we say it is. So if we understand architecture or the work of architects to be anything at these corporate firms, we must ask ourselves, why is it that these words also echo our professional associations today and even our universities? Well, it turns out that large architecture corporations, including DimGim, gripped the reins of the profession and began to revise its structure to suit the expansionary needs of their firms. Beginning in the middle of the 1950s, AIA presidents were more commonly leaders of large corporate firms. Leon Chatelain of Chatelain, Gogler and Nolan, to Phil Will of Perkins and Will, to George Kassebaum of HOK, to Archibald Rogers of RTKL, and on and on. And one of the first things to change was the AIA's handbook, the same single volume bound handbook that George argues enabled architects to assemble their profession, and that was relatively unchanged until then. But by the 1960s, the handbook was renamed and was no longer a single volume. Instead, it was a multi-volume three-ring binder, a portfolio, in the words of the three-ring binder's inventor, a disassembled book of 20 leaflets known as circulars that could be swapped out, updated, or expanded. And by the 80s, there were actually several volumes, several binders of these. A profession disassembled, following George's argument, open to expansion. A second impact on the profession was in the ethics code of the AIA, which was radically redefined by corporate leaders in the late 1960s. Since 1909, the Code of Ethics tried to protect the market position and to protect what it was that an architect did. Tongue twister. It was established that to be a professional, architects could not compete with each other on the basis of price. Architects could not steal projects from each other. Architects could only engage in the designing of buildings, not construction, not design build, not real estate. And as most scholars of this period have suggested, it was President Nixon and later Reagan's governments who used the Sherman Antitrust Act to encourage competition. The Sherman Antitrust Act, which was intended to prevent monopolies, to actually threaten the AIA beginning in the 1970s and force it to encourage competition and a broader definition of the architect. Less known, however, is how the leaders of corporate firms were actually encouraging these changes. Indeed, California's AIA president argued in 1969 that, quote, "We should welcome such efforts of those large corporate conglomerates to increase the scope of the architect's service." And New York's AIA president said architects were, quote, "kidding themselves" if they didn't make similar moves. The AIA circulated a draft of its new Code of Ethics that year in 1969, 2 years before the Department of Justice formally sanctioned the AIA, allowing them to use a broad definition of the architect. But how, I'm sure you're all wondering, did they nudge the government to enforce these neoliberal ideas? Here are words from the president of the AIA National in 1971, Robert Hastings, a former president of the large architecture and engineering firm Smith, Hinchman & Grills. Quote, "The architect today in the institute he directs must now plunge actively into political life, enlist allies, swing votes, mobilize community action, and take positions on issues that once were thought to be outside our rightful action of concern. We can have anything we want and that we are willing to work and pay for, but we must strike a balance between our aspirations and our resources." I think in some ways these words seem to be all too relevant still today. But in effect, Hastings' advocacy for political interference was challenging the profession's long-standing mechanisms of social control in order to set themselves free after they had been built up by the government's projects. It's no surprise then that we find a flurry of lawsuits against, such as this one in 1978, launched by the state of Massachusetts against several architecture firms, including DIMGM, for quid pro quos. They found a network of architecture firms awarded billions of government dollars worth of design contracts in the 1960s, such as for the construction of the award-winning Holyoke Community College, in exchange for campaign contributions to the Republican Party trying to re-elect Nixon. The court ultimately concluded that, quote, "the state designer selection board system was manipulated by design firms knowledgeable about state bureaucracy, and their buildings were often shoddily constructed because they were built too rapidly and had dangerous structural defects." Here again, politics was undermining the ethical code of the profession and the legal argument for licensure to protect the public. Or separately, classified letters in the Watergate scandal materials revealing how firms like DIMGM were actually driving the scandal. The administrative chair of the Republican National Committee that was trying to re-elect Nixon was an architect and vice president of DIMGM. And he was responsible for hiring James McCord, a former CIA officer, as head of security for Nixon, and who was the first to be indicted. Or here, a final photograph, one of my favorites, of DIMGM architects in 1982 sipping beer and vodka sodas with Ronald Reagan's chief of staff, Michael Deaver, at the Bohemian Grove in Northern California. the exclusive all-men club that meets in the summers, off the record, and they still meet still to this day, of presidents, CEOs, and professors. And this is the place where Oppenheimer once discussed the atomic bomb. So I end by returning to George's opening question for us, and a question that brings us here today. Who is an architect? We have seen what work it is that they can now do. Anything. Motivated primarily by profit and power. But I close with my historian hat on by posing a second question for us to consider. Who gets to decide? Since the middle of the 20th century, it's been the leaders of large corporate firms. Yet we must remember that today, smaller firms still collectively outnumber larger ones. They still outsize them in their command of billings, and they have the power to come together, to form unions, cooperatives, or to join activist organizations such as the Architecture Lobby, to answer George's question outside of existing institutional structures and spheres of corporate influence. As labor scholars like the late Jane McAlevey have argued, it is in the history of corporate organization, political corruption, and insider games that organizers for change can learn their most useful lessons. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to give this talk today. And I got to say, I give a lot of talks, and I've been teaching for almost as long as George has. But I had a really hard time putting this talk together because I realized as I was formulating my thoughts that, and look back on my career, that a lot of what George has worked on has touched so many things that I've been thinking about that it was really hard to kind of organize a way of looking at this problem. And so I'd like to frame my part of this conversation with three questions, one by George, one by me, and one by Daniel Susskind, who Elizabeth referred to earlier. So George is asking this question, exactly who are we as architects? And one of the questions I often ask my students in our professional practice classes is, how long does it take to have a good idea? You're going to be given a fixed number of resources in time and money, and your job is to come up with a good idea. How long does that take? And can you get that out? Because if you can't actually reconcile all these forces in which you're going to be operating. And then the Susskinds ask a really interesting question in their book, The Future of the Professions. How do we solve the problems to which, in this case, architects are currently our best answer? Because as the Susskinds put forward, and I'll talk about this argument in a minute, it may not necessarily be the person of the architect. And so I've been really, really interested in questions of project delivery for my entire career. And the way I've always described it to my students is you're trying to reconcile three forces in some way. Clients, who are the folks who aspire to make things in the built environment. Designers who in the modern construct do this thing called design intention. We don't actually make buildings. We create the definition of what we intend the building to be. And then, as I like to say, we then dare contractors to build those buildings. And then builders who are actually responsible for executing a built artifact. And one of the central questions of my career is, how do you reconcile all this stuff, and where do architects play in this equation? And I've been really interested throughout my trajectory, which is the only way I could really make sense out of this talk, in really three questions. First, in a world where technology, as one of those external forces that Elizabeth described, is changing what we do as architects, what's our agency and how do we organize our work? That's question number one. Question number two is, if our agency is evolving, what methods, including technological methods, do we use to actually make stuff happen? And question number three is, what is our value proposition? Well, how do we translate our values into actual systems that work inside these systems of delivery? And so I kind of blew up my normal talks, and I want to investigate this question and its relationship to some of the things that George has been thinking about and talking about in sort of three topics. And the first is this issue of project delivery. Now, I started the most important part of my practice career as a little bit of a conundrum. I was a project manager in a design architect's office, which meant my job, as described by Caesar, I was the cow catcher on the front of the locomotive, get the cows off the track so the designers could do their job, which meant I spent a lot of time trying to figure out who was doing what to whom on this project. And so as part of that, I started relatively early in my career writing the project delivery chapters in the Handbook of Professional Practice because I couldn't find this stuff anywhere. There wasn't any place where you could actually go look and say, who are the players and what are their relationships and what are the different systems and how do you pick one? How do you actually pick a project delivery model? Because if you weren't, what I say to my students and what I realized when I was trying to be a manager on the design side of things was if you didn't understand the system, you couldn't get what you wanted in the system. If you didn't understand the role of what the contractor was actually doing and what their obligations were and what their risk profile was, believe it or not, you couldn't actually design the building. And so at that same time, I got invited to join the AIA Contract Documents Committee, which was mostly architects sitting in rooms with projectors writing contracts. But what we were really doing was institutionalizing the practice standards of the profession in whatever way the AIA is capable of doing that. And I worked on sublime things and I worked on ridiculous things. The sublime thing I worked on was when I was chair of the documents committee, we wrote the first IPD contracts, which was the first time the AIA had actually done something projective around contracts instead of sort of rejective or looking backwards. The IPD contract system's a failure. The biggest contribution apparently I made to the Contract Documents Committee was I designed a new numbering system for the contracts. So I went on their website yesterday to look to see what that's looking like, and their website says, confused about our numbering system? So I'm like, okay, maybe that's my legacy. I confused a generation of architects, right? So in addition to George, another interesting influence on my career actually has been Peter Eisenman, and Peter and I operate at diagonal opposites of the architectural continuum. He's a theoretician, I teach practice. Our most significant professional exchange was when he once called me to ask me how to handle the accounts receivable in his office. But he turned me onto this very interesting book. I want to read you a quote from this book. The basic decisions of construction control are often incomplete or unduly rushed because necessary information is not available sufficiently ahead of time or is not complete enough. On many occasions, the members of the team could, but do not ease this problem by supplying the data that would facilitate the preparation of fuller and more useful information by others. Building construction is remarkable among industrial activities for the lack of detailed information about how it proceeds. Until more is known, there can be no basis for improvement. And when I was working on the BIM strategy at Autodesk, I thought this was a really interesting quote, which comes from this book, which Peter introduced to me, called Communications in the Construction Industry by Higgin and Jessup, 1965. That was almost 70 years ago. And we're still telegraphing these same sets of questions. And we're still sort of trying to reconcile through a series of delivery arrangements, how to reconcile these three forces of aspiration, intention, and execution. And in this book, there's this whole series of diagrams, which George has extended in some of his work about how these different players play and how their agency is articulated through the bigger system of how we deliver projects. And my interest has always been figuring out what we do in our box, what the relationship is between our circle and their boxes, and how technology changes that value proposition. And a lot of George's work has been very, very influential in that. And so in the kind of canonical diagram that I draw 100 times in my classroom between clients and designers and builders, and we talk about the lack of the contract between the designer and the builder and blah, blah, blah. But there's been a very interesting evolution over the last 20 years in combination. There's been a discussion in combination with the evolution of technology around the parallel evolution of project delivery models. And when Peggy Deemer and I wrote our book, Building in the Future, back in 2008, right about the time drafting culture was coming out, Paulo Tombesi, who's a labor economist, wrote a very interesting chapter where he talked about this idea of flexible specialization. He said designing a building involves a whole bunch of stuff. Architects don't think very broadly about what all that stuff is. It's possible that technology could form an intermediating catalyst to involve us in this broader proposition of building design. And at that time, I was sort of driving the Autodesk's building information strategy, and I endorsed this idea. I thought this was a great idea. I thought this is a particular moment where the evolution of the technological platforms could actually shift these kind of dumb diagrams that are, where's the lasers in it? These kind of dumb diagrams into more sophisticated diagrams like that, like integrated delivery and other forms of collaboration. But where are we now? It's 2025. There have maybe been 1,000 IPD projects in the United States, which is a total nothing burger. I wrote a really cool contract if you want to use it, but nobody's using it. And really what's happening now is the information infrastructure is remediating the relationship between designers and builders in a completely different way, because there's a whole different kind of wave of technology coming along. And there's a whole bunch of the sort of information systems. These are the instruments of service that connect the act of design and construction that the information technology is kind of remediating and may bring back this idea of flexible specialization sort of in a different way. And I don't think you can make that argument. And I think, a lot of George's thinking has amplified mine on this. You can't make that argument until you go back to this question of instruments of service. So I wish I'd brought this up, Elizabeth, when you guys were writing this, because when I first started at Autodesk and we were working on this modeling thing, I used to show them this drawing. This became known inside the company as Phil's Garage. And so the question I asked my development teams was, okay, you see this 8.5 by 11 drawing that I did of a new garage behind my house? I did this with a pencil and a scale and a triangle. I was watching a football game. I was drinking a beer. It took about 30 minutes. How come I can hire a Yankee carpenter to build this building from this sketch and imply all of that stuff on the right? I can imply the three-dimensional form. I can imply the structure. I can imply certain aspects of the details. This is my dumb version of your really cool Harvard working drawings diagram, right? I guess that explains the difference, right? They're Harvard, this is Yale. And so the question really was, how does the efficacy of the technology change the strategy? And one of the things I was really interested in was how this question of orthographic drawing is so incredibly efficient in telling a complex story. This drawing on the left is Robert Smithson's drawing called A Round Window and a Round Wall. And it's essentially a design drawing of a round rose window in a curving wall. Okay, George, how many shop drawings would it take to do this window now? 50, 60, 80? And so instead of driving the technology toward the remediation of these relationships in the delivery structure, we drove all of our technology to just make it faster to do this exact same thing by using computation to make more drawings. So on the right is a shop drawing of the stainless steel top of the Petronas Tower, which was designed in Caesar's office when I was working there. That is an AutoCAD drawing. That was a copy of an AutoCAD drawing that the associate architects who were based in Kuala Lumpur made of our AutoCAD drawing, which was a design development drawing that we made in New Haven. So we drew it in AutoCAD, we plotted it out, we sent it to Kuala Lumpur, they copied it in their computers, they plotted it out, then they sent it back to England to make a shop drawing. And so when I first joined Autodesk, my new boss, the CEO, Carol Bartz, said, I want you to find out why Federal Express makes more money sending drawings that our software makes around the world than we make selling the software. And it's because of this systemic friction to information integration across the delivery model that's really causing this problem. So I had this thesis, right? We're going to change the means of representation. We're going to give tools like 3D modeling. We're going to create a new paradigm for collaboration. This is a diagram from my first book, where there was a time when we used CAD to just draw drawings, and now we're going to use a model, and we're going to extract reports. And Chuck Eastman's work here at Georgia Tech was very important in a lot of the theory of all this stuff. But it's actually turned out that what we're really doing is still this stuff on the right. We're using these tools to make working drawings, to make more working drawings. And there's a kind of missed opportunity there in terms of what the role of the architect is in these systems, right? And I've had a copy of Drafting Culture on my desk since it came out in 2008. And George kind of predicted this idea that these three-dimensional representations are not actually creating an opportunity for collaboration, but they're creating larger spaces of cognitive distance, and that we're not really using these automated tools in ways that could change the role of the architect. But from building information modeling, now we have artificial intelligence. And we've gone from automation to autonomous design generation. And we're doing a lot of kind of experimenting with these questions in a course that I'm leaving here tonight to go teach tomorrow morning on artificial intelligence at Yale, where you can take a sentence or a bunch of sentences and in theory translate them into a building, right? But maybe not so fast. Maybe this isn't quite so easy as it looks. Same prompt, 4 platforms, 4 buildings, very convincing, completely unrelated, because at least on the generative side of this next generation of technology, these tools do not understand anything about buildings, nothing. What they understand is things about images about buildings, not actual buildings. So it makes them very hard to control, and it makes them kind of sexy, but I don't think that's actually the problem. I don't think that's actually the opportunity here. A lot of my students are working at a firm in New York called Hart Howerton. They're a mid-sized firm in New York. They sent me this diagram of all the digital tools that they're using in their office right now. I could not figure out what this diagram was all about. I had to give it to ChatGPT and say, please make me a list of all the tools in this diagram and find their website so I can find out what these guys are doing. And Hart Howerton is not Zaha Hadid's office. This is just normal, everyday work. So flexible specialization, the diagrams are quite similar graphically. It's evolved into a completely different and kind of super weird thing. But we're at a moment here, I think, a technological inflection point where the artificial intelligence platforms are actually providing an opportunity to change the nature of the design process and leverage architecture into places, the kinds of places that both Elizabeth and Aaron are talking about, changed sort of value propositions. This is a diagram from my last book that sort of talks about, we as architects make all this stuff in the green box, right? And there's this kind of magical mystery world of automated and autonomous artificial intelligence algorithms that could be giving us an opportunity, if we don't spend all of our time making images of buildings, to do things in a different way, to automate the generation of design processes, to evaluate alternatives, to automate the construction site, to begin to design and understand the kind of autonomous, optimized systems buildings like the ones that Elizabeth showed you earlier. And there is a lot of stuff going on out there that we as a profession, at our peril, in my opinion, are ignoring. There's a lot of work around documentation production, underlying design analysis, project coordination and information sharing, and just raw production of construction work. And by the way, there's a huge amount of money being spent in AI in the construction industry right now, and it is not being spent to help you make pretty pictures of buildings. It's being spent to do all of this stuff, billions of dollars every year, which is going to create a different kind of dynamic in those project delivery diagrams in terms of the generation and use and efficacy of data and the relationship between the act of designing things and the act of making things. And I feel like that's just something we need to keep an eye on. And I have argued, I started building this diagram when I was at Autodesk and using it with my students, that project delivery models have evolved in parallel with the evolution of technologies. That the project delivery models that when I started my career in the 70s, everything was design, bid, build, began to evolve in parallel with things like CAD, things like BIM, things like representational systems. As I got older, I kept having to extend this diagram to the right? And now I'm in this kind of yellow twilight zone where I don't know what the implications of AI are for project delivery, but I do know that the dynamics of the kind of transactional nature that we've been able to default into, where we take every new technology and either make a working drawing or a rendering with it, has got to change. That's got to change in this current environment. And so a couple of weeks from now, I'm going to give a talk to the American College of Construction Lawyers about AI. And you haven't lived until you're the only architect in a room with 500 lawyers. And so what I've said to these guys is, look, in terms of this triumvirate and the things you have to build to make sense of this, you have to talk about the architect's role in three questions. Where does data come from? Who has the authority to make decisions and take responsibility for them? And what's the risk-reward calculation? Where are the risks and where are the rewards? So, these are things that they can talk about. We won't worry about that. So I want to finish with a few thoughts about who is the architect around this question of agency. And Daniel Susskind, who gave an interview in Elizabeth and Jacob's book, has written these two books, one, The Future of the Professions, and the other, A World Without Work. And I would strongly recommend, especially the students in the room, read both of them, because one is a larger argument about economics, but the other is an argument about the meaning of professionalism in a world where algorithms do a bunch of stuff that we can do. And essentially what the Suskins argue in The Future of the Professions is the internet and artificial intelligence democratize expertise. And if I can synopsize this and critique my argument, Elizabeth, eventually we're not going to need any professionals. We will not need professionals because the democratization will overwhelm the need for professionals. Now, I don't happen to buy that argument, and I'm old enough that I heard that argument about the internet. Didn't turn out to be the case. But what the Suskins say in their book is there's this thing they call the grand bargain. And the grand bargain is we place our trust in professionals by granting them exclusivity over a wide range of socially significant services, paying them a fair wage. That's the subject of a different symposium. Conferring upon them independence, autonomy, rights of self-determination, and according them respect and status. That's the great bargain, right? That's the diagram of the lower right-hand side of Elizabeth's triangle there. And in my book, what I tried to do is unpack this question of when you have autonomous algorithms that can start to do stuff, where does that affect what we do as architects? And I tried to create a definition of architecture that had less to do with what the Suskins call tasks, which is like doing stuff, and more about obligations and responsibilities. And I found the construct useful for my students too, because what I've said to them is, look, in essence, if you look at our role in the project delivery systems, we do four things. We are the titular protectors of the public's health and safety. We are the agent of the client, translating their intentions, their aspirations into intentions. We are a guide, I couldn't think of a better word, to the construction team. George, you might have a better word. I thought guide, like, yeah, I drew it the way I want it to be. Can you help me? But I'm not going to be too involved. That's a kind of description of a guide. And then we run these project teams, right? And the question I asked myself in my book is, how much of this stuff could you get an AI to do? How much of these kinds of roles could you get an artificial intelligence algorithm to play? And the Suskins would argue almost all of them, because what they are saying is you're going to see two waves of automation, or two waves of happenings. First, there's going to be a ton of automation of tasks, and there'll be a lot of innovators. And the students in the room should check out this website called AI and AEC. It's this guy who catalogs every startup in the AEC space doing AI. I checked his site on Thursday. It had 1,400 startup companies on it. There's a lot of stuff out there. And then what the Susskind say is increasingly capable systems will transform the work of professionals, giving birth to new ways of sharing practical expertise. In the long run, the second future will prevail and our professions will be dismantled incrementally. And so the question is, do we buy this argument? Because what clients are looking for in these systems that have been described to you are spatial solutions, and currently designers are the answer to that. The question is, in the future, does that continue to be the case? And what I would argue, and what I think is a logical extension of the historical argument that George makes in assembling the architect, is we better start thinking about this stuff. We better start thinking very carefully about what our role is and where the opportunities are. This is kind of blurry, isn't it? That didn't come out too well. And so that brings me to an interesting moment. For those of you following professional licensure, our friends from NCARB have come up with 16 things you need to be able to do to prove that you're a licensable architect. And we can call it the competency standard. I was just on a really scary webinar about this on Tuesday night. And I looked at the competency standard and I said, if we use this paradigm of technology can either automate or act autonomously, and artificial intelligence algorithms act autonomously, how many of the competency standards will survive an attack by artificial intelligence? By my calculation, it's only 3 of the 16. And so what's interesting here is in Elizabeth's triumvirate construct, under this idea of practice versus the profession is in the process of defining itself in a way that's likely going to get it automated into oblivion, which is really not a good thing. It is not a good thing. It's a values definition opportunity that we need to look at, right? And so in this context, as George wrote in the Design magazine, what becomes of this idea of the parochial title architect? And if the title architect is all about protecting the public's health and safety, and I can automate a large part of that, what's our value proposition going forward? What value do we bring to the built environment? And I would argue that our profession shouldn't be dismantled because we're desperately needed, but we're going to have to take a broader view of what it is that we actually do. And maybe the definition of the public's health and safety, as it evolved from, say, fire safety to sustainability, needs to look at a whole other set of potential issues. And so I think the way George has framed this problem, what he calls mediated agency and collective intelligence, the mediated agency has to do with in a world that's going to be in a world of project delivery that's restructured by this technological underpinning. And the definition of collective intelligence has really, really changed because it's accessible and indexed and available in different ways. How do we actually mediate our agency in that context? And, Victoria Beach, who I guess is not at Harvard anymore, right, Elizabeth? She wrote in the handbook, expecting an architect to design a safe structure is like expecting a chef to cook a safe meal. It is at once a very high ethical requirement and a very low expectation. And now we're in the process of setting up competencies that are incredibly low expectations. And so I think what George argues here is actually advice for us as a profession going forward. Because what he says is the interplay of competing interests as well as the choices amongst alternative paths has historically ordered the field of professional practice in ways we have hardly begun to fathom. And I think one of the things that you've seen in all 3 of these talks up to this point are what these forces look like. And I think particularly for the students in the room, the question is, how are you going to address them? And what does the ultimate future of our profession look like in this context? So with that, George, you get to wrap this up.
Oh yeah, I need my glasses. Yeah, and first I need to say thank you. Thank you to the dean and to Julie and John, all of you. Thank you for your presence. You honor me. Thank you. And thank you for these brilliant presentations today. You see why I'm so proud to be part of a community of concern that includes people like this in it, because it begins to expand our understanding of what we mean by practice. I think if we look at all of these presentations so far together, then we can see the suggestion of the outlines of a much larger collective project of architectural practice, of cultural and environmental stewardship, of progressive social reform, in fact. I've tried to contribute to this project through my own work over the years. What I thought I could try to do today is just to give you a little, well, to use your chef metaphor, maybe the similar dangers, a little taste of what I have cooking on the stove right now at home. So it's a work in progress that tries to illustrate some of these themes in narrative and maybe even allegorical terms. The title of the project, the working title, is Small Town Architect. Admittedly at play with certain ambiguities, small town architect. Is that an architect practicing in a small town, say, or an architect designer of small towns? Or simply an architect with an apt name, small town, that we might find somewhere on a shingle. Right now, this is what the project looks like. It's in the form of so many ephemera, a collage of research materials germane to topics of American history and its evolving building culture, an office manual of sorts for that small town architect. Themes are coalescing along a series of intersecting vectors, human, material, cultural, and even pathogenic, viral paths of migration, dispersal, and displacement, by which the concept of architecture arrived on these shores was projected onto the land by surveyors and speculators, then propagated by crafters and drafters, the architect's four vocational forebears. Those vectors tracked the encounters and exchanges, so often violent, among the indigenous peoples of this continent, European colonial settlers, and enslaved peoples brought from Africa. Those historically contingent relations are deeply embedded in the American spatial practices and building culture that we enact today. By reimagining and contextualizing some of those relations, I'm trying to shape a set of parables, maybe, like so many stories from a grandparent, as may illuminate some of the tropes and topographies of our building and design practices still present, even if latent today. I submit for your consideration this marginal note that appeared in a 1943 volume of the British journal Architectural Review. We have received an appeal from the Directorate of Salvage and Recovery, pointing out that tracing cloth, after being boiled, can be put to excellent use by hospitals for bandages and dressings. Architects are invited to offer any tracing cloth which is no longer needed, to local hospitals, most of which have laundries to boil the cloth. I've been pondering this conjured up image of architects' drawings transformed into bandages, first bleached of their ink, then repurposed as surrogate skin. You must be aware that before drawings were printed outputs of digital models, they were handmade artifacts, lines of flowing substance, inscribed onto some surface according to the technological affordances of the day, on parchment or vellum, for example, which are animal skins. Or today, they're paper imitations made of cotton fiber or wood pulp. At the height of World War II and for a half century prior, the medium of choice and necessity was tracing cloth, a tightly woven, then steamed, stretched, and starched linen fabric, yielding a drawing surface both durable and translucent. The use of tracing cloth was not just an arbitrary choice among a variety of other alternatives, but rather was implicated as part of a larger system of design production and drawing reproduction by way of blueprints. The term blueprint begins to appear in English usage in the 1880s, comporting with the rise of blueprinting as a means of drawing reproduction in the booming offices of engineers and architects of the Gilded Age, a period not unlike today, when the expectations for design and construction documentation became increasingly intense. Cyanotype is the technical term for the photochemical process that produces a negative photographic impression, a duotone of white lines on a characteristic background of Prussian blue. The chemical process was developed in England in the 1840s by Sir John Herschel, and a commercial application was first exhibited by a Swiss firm at the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. Prior to the emergence of blueprint as a commercially viable means of drawing reproduction, drawings were manually copied through transfer and tracing on opaque papers. This laborious process was significantly streamlined by the widespread availability of translucent drawing media, such as linen tracing cloth, which in turn facilitated the blueprinting process. Linen textile production is an ancient craft, especially prevalent in regions with conditions conducive to the cultivation of the flax plant, from which it is made, first homespun, and then later through industrial process. We tend to associate linen quality with the most highly refined uses in clothing, bedding, and dining accessories. But in the late 18th and especially 19th centuries, linen also became a lucrative commodity in the triangular transatlantic trade. Scottish, Irish, and German mills provided bolts of rough linen cloth, also called slave cloth, for tailoring by and for enslaved African laborers of plantation work clothes, often dyed and overprinted with patterns in indigo blue, blueprints of a sort. We can see several corresponding peaks in our Google word cloud chronology, and both terms, blueprint and tracing cloth, reach a wartime crescendo around 1943, followed by tracing cloth's steady decline in both drawing and textual usage, an index of the synthetic revolution that brought us mylar in the 1950s. Waning use of the term Blueprint can be ascribed to the displacement by diazo technology that yielded a new office vernacular. We no longer spoke of blueprints, but their inverse, blue lines. But then miraculously, commencing in the 1980s and ironically coinciding with the widespread adoption of computer-aided design and drafting tools and a host of new printing technologies, the anachronistic term blueprint rebounds and begins its renewed and vigorous ascent in usage. But this time we infer as a figure of speech. Blueprint for change, blueprint for the future, blueprint for democracy. Blueprint became a synonym, a trope, a figure of speech, only residually associated with the architect's historically delimited executive products, but now used metaphorically to evoke the modus operandi of vision and know-how, a kind of strategic map for navigating along a principled and future-leaning path. Now, by trying to connect some dots, our small-town architect may better speculate about some of the trajectories of cultural and material transformation that have historically shaped architectural practice and that might be at play in other forms today. Same cultural vectors that led from the flax plant to the production of both fine linens and slave cloth, that necessitated the transformation of tracing cloth into gauze bandages, blueprints into figures of speech, are emblematic and sobering reminders of the forgotten sources and unpredictable destinations of our own digitally mediated constructions. Culture is a layered thing, a palimpsest of blueprints and practices. Everyday tools and assumptions of architectural production tend to mask the logics of reigning technopolitical regimes, which they in turn perpetuate and enact. They contain the residue of past practices and traditions, once often forgotten, but once recognized, can remind us of their potential, whether to liberate or to oppress. And likewise, they contain the seeds of some new emergent formations, once barely perceivable to us now in the maelstrom of events and forces, forces that have not yet fully taken shape, but we can wager soon will. So, who is the small town architect? The small town architect is one who takes the time to humbly reflect upon such things, to consider them, even while being compelled into action. Small town, the architect, small town, thus performs both as a narrative device and as the personification of their very own inquisitive but practical pursuits. That's what I'm working on. We'll see where it goes.
I'd like to ask our speakers, our guests to come on up to the stage while we get ourselves organized. All right. Wow. What a, my brain is just spinning with everything that I heard from all four of you. I think, one of the things that I thought I wanted to do is, as we listened to Elizabeth, Aaron, Phil, and George speak today, it really brought to question in my mind, all these kinds of pressures, right? Between the profession, like what is the profession? Where is it going? What are the opportunities? Where are the challenges? The practice, as Elizabeth pointed out, is always agile, right? It's very flexible. So that's just kind of go with the flow. And is responsive to what's happening in the profession and then also the discipline. And so one of the things that I thought I wanted to start with talking about is maybe let's start with the speculative at the beginning. One of the things that I thought was really interesting in George's essay is he talks about and we saw actually in several of the presentations, quoting from George's essay, the architects make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. Whatever architects may make next, they will likely make of their profession. And so one of the things I found really interesting is that he goes on to talk about how, one can imagine forms of spatially distributed intelligence, both metaphor and material evidence of their know-how and their vision. Phil referenced this in his presentation, talking about mediated agency and collective intelligence. And this is what George mentions. He talks about the opportunity that the architect is not a fixed entity per se. It's not limited to a narrow single archetypal figure, but rather it's a collective body of knowledge. And so one of the things that I thought was very interesting about this is I started to think about what's the promise of that kind of architect, and how is it that, we might engage in, pushing the boundaries of the discipline and the practice of architecture, and through this kind of continuous process of revision and reconstitution of the role of the architect, with the hope that these spheres between the discipline and the practice that they can start to apply pressure then on what we see as might be the narrow scope of what the profession of architecture is today. So I actually want to start with one essay that none of you talked about in your presentations. One of my favorites in the Harvard Design Magazine was called The Counterfactual Architect. I just thought this was brilliant. It's a conversation between, were there four people in this conversation, 4 or 5 people in the conversation, 5 people. And it was really this question of, what might be the unrealized potentials of architectural practice if with the benefit of being able to look backwards, learn from history, and understand the different pressures along the time that cause certain things to happen. What if that could help reshape the way that we think about what we do? What if the architect had gained more authority, not less, over the building project, which I think, Phil, you talk about that in your presentation, that we're continuing to lose more and more in the kind of, impending, advent of, AI and automation, and what is that going to do, to us? So George says the unfulfilled potential of the past can be a practical roadmap to imagine and strive for a more diverse field. I really appreciate the way that George talks about the statement that underscores the importance of learning from the past. And actually, in the end, when you talked about small town architect, and I loved how you talked about, like, is it a small town architect? Is it small, Mr. Town, the architect? But you're still always kind of going back and saying, like, how do we go back and understand what happened in the past? So I guess maybe one of the questions that I might start with for the 4 of you, and ask any one of you to speak, to go ahead and jump in, but in what ways may we push the boundaries of the discipline and the practice of architecture? And basically, I guess, what is the end game in this kind of continuous revision and reconstitution of the role of the architect? Like, we seem like we're constantly like remaking and we are rethinking ourselves. So what is that end game? And then maybe as a follow-up to that, how do we move this conversation outside of this small circle so that it's embraced more broadly across scales? So I'll just start with that.
It's a conceptual conundrum, because in normative practice, the way competence is measured is by this very abstract concept called the standard of care, which takes me like a week to explain to my students because it's not written down anywhere. And it's a kind of ethos of what it means to do things competently based on a retrograde historical standard. Like, what did a competent architect do in the past that I can compare you to? Which is an incredible, like, coefficient of friction to innovation. It's really hard to do new things in normative practice because when you do new things, you're outside the standard of care. And so the risk reward equation is what creates, I think, a huge weight on that question. Because if I were all powerful, I would convene enough architects to redefine health, safety, and welfare and keep the definition of licensure. So we had responsibility for more important stuff. It's really hard to do under the norms of the profession.
See if like French do it a little bit differently. I remember this conversation we had.
The French do it differently?
Am I making this up? There was something about being responsible for, because in this conversation, this counterfactual conversation was really fascinating. It was two artists who had constructed this kind of game. And George actually really shaped the key kind of question that it began with. And then it was a conversation between Grace Law and Michael Osman, George and Jacob and myself. And this question of the health, safety, and welfare was on the table. And I remember thinking, are there other ways of defining this in other societies? Maybe I'm making that up.
I don't remember if it was the French, but we were talking about the way structure was practiced, what the way practice was structured differently based upon the sort of political economy that it's inserted into or that it forms inside of. And I don't remember exactly that example, but I guess the term that I was trying to insert into the discussion in the piece that I wrote for the Harvard Design Magazine was, it was meant to be a little bit provocative to say what we're talking about, generally speaking, when we're talking about the architect today, is we're talking about the health safety architect, because that's the one that's defined by the state, and the state regulates who may call themselves an architect. And it is tied to that very particular definition.
And how you get there.
Right. That's right. So we're immediately coming up against the boundaries of our own political economy and the structure of law in terms of how we describe something that we would also say is much broader as a disciplinary field. And so but I was intrigued with the way Phil is reading this new competency standard that NCARB's putting forward.
I hate it.
Because it's even further reduction. And what's really even more alarming, because we know how the role that these collateral organizations play in the shaping then of the accreditation standards. So then they get projected into the schools of architecture. And then it depends on the institution, but it's really becomes a potentially a sort of a race to the bottom, to the base, to demonstrate that a school of architecture, a program, professional program, meets that competency standard.
And if you got 2 beers in me, what I tell you is, let's make a list of the things that you could most easily automate with an artificial intelligence algorithm, and then we'll turn them into the competency matrix. It's just, it was insane. It's completely insane.
But I think this raises a really important point. I mean, back to Elizabeth's first point. I mean, really, we're talking about agreement. Like, how do you have agreement about competency across these so-called collaterals? And, you know, one of my favorite scholars the scholar of professions, Magali Larson, you know, she argued that to have a profession, you have to have agreement across these so-called collaterals between institutions. You know, the university has to be in agreement about what do architects need to know? And that has to be shared and matched with the professional associations, right? And businesses. And so if we don't have agreement between, let's say, NAB and NCARB or universities and firms, you know, the professional model doesn't actually make sense, right? It doesn't actually theoretically exist. So like, where then is the space to form agreement, right?
We talked
I
about
think
this
that's the
at
question.
lunch.
Yeah, exactly. So, but agreement, coming to terms with what it is that architects do and what they need to know. It's so decentralized, but it's also driven by, you know, how many, like, what are the salaries of the NCARB leader? You know, like $400,000, $500,000 salaries, like who are saying this is what needs to be in the competency.
Or the stuff is bubbling up from state licensing boards, which that's not their job. Their job is not to define the profession. It's our job. We just don't have a platform to do it.
And I guess the question that I would have too is what does that mean for education, right? Because an educator is where, you know, caught, you know, in a really, you know, almost an intractable situation. If there is this pressure with this, I was as horrified as you, Phil, when I first saw the NCARB competency matrix or diagram, whatever they call it. I mean, I was horrified when I saw that. Because I started thinking to myself, like, wow, like, you know, we're continuing to move closer and closer to, you know, a very reduced model of, you know, what value we bring. You know, suddenly it's like, you know, what are we doing? And then what does that mean then for education, right? All four of you, in addition to your roles in practice, are all educators as well. And so I think that's one of the things that maybe I want to throw that question out to you guys. Like, what can we do then? Like, how do we prepare our students, or how do we shape our curricula that prepares our students for, you know, what the practice or the field of architecture holds for them?
I mean, I think one thing to just think about first is the word practice, right? And how we teach about practice. So for those that were sort of writing about and coming up with the term practice in the 60s and 70s, for them, practice was a theory of history, meaning that to study a practice, you're actually trying to figure out, like, where did you go to school? Where did you, you know, grow up? And how all of those things are sort of reproduced through your actions and through your drawing. So I think that really models, I think, what the university aimed for historically, right? Cultural production. And so there are a number of scholars, like, you know, Bill Reading's fascinating book about the university in ruins, I think really echoes what's happening with NAB, you know, as well as NCARB, right? This sort of hollowing out of this cultural function of the university. And then we see that, you know, in the NAB criteria, now history theory is like optional, right? Or you can basically meet the criteria by having a lecture series and not even having history classes.
Is that true?
Yes, which is
Jeez.
like totally ridiculous to me. And they like, oopsies, they said. And so to me, that like the hollowing out of the university is the same, you know, it's a sort of parallel conversation, you know, now like excellence is the word that we use, but what is excellence, right? How do you measure excellence? And so I think that's the same kind of conversation.
Yeah, and there's a parallel question about who the leaders of the profession are and what we're training these people to do. I mean, at least in our institution, there's a kind of implicit, you can see it in the university's mission statement. We train the leaders of tomorrow. That's our job, right? So what's the definition of leadership? Well, if you ask our students and our faculty, the definition of leadership is advancing the intellectual agenda of the profession, right? In whatever form that is. Is that where, you know, is that the right answer to the question at this historical moment?
You know, we've actually been asking the question right now, the domain of study that I suppose applies to this would be the professional practice domain. And we've actually been thinking about renaming it the practice domain. And
I like that. Can I steal that idea?
Totally.
Okay.
It broadens it a little bit. I mean, we have all of our NAB accredited things and we're doing other responsible stuff at the GSD. But we are actually, and, you know, and I was really struck, Aaron was saying the other day, you know, now we're starting to see history and theory play a huge role in the way that we think about practice curriculum. And that is definitely happening at the GSD. I mean, the courses are, you know, in a moment of very, very rapid change, it feels incredibly important for the students to be able to understand and contextualize this moment in the arc of history and to understand that what we think of as these structures are not immovable casts. They're actually highly flexible, and we can have agency. And I think that's actually leadership, is this idea that we have efficacy and that we know that our students are interested in going out into the world and making meaningful change, and being able to then get it linked up into the system so that it can actually can have impact.
I mean, all of us have been speaking about practice in a very expansive way.
Yes.
Right. And so it's beyond a kind of a how to twirl your pencil, although I would.
They don't know what you're talking about.
Well, yeah, well, okay,
I do,
but
because I can do it.
and maybe that will be one of my parables, and I don't. So that almost socio-political notion of practice, of being engaged in the world, right, in a kind of a set of activities in which we're actually making the world, and then the world rebounds upon us and remakes us, right? That's what we call praxis, right? Isn't that the definition of praxis? Second row. And so, the way we're talking about practice, you sort of say, well, oh, actually, how do you contain that in a single course in a NAB accredited curriculum? So, but we would sort of say, well, no, that's just one subset of the issues that have to be covered within a professional education as currently constituted, but that practice is a much broader idea that actually seeps into a different way of conceptualizing the entire curriculum. I would sort of say the way we think about enacting our work, let's sort of say in design studio, which tends to take up a lot of time in the School of Architecture, because it's a kind of a strange situation where it's this very artificial thing that suddenly semester starts and you've maybe had a lottery and you find yourself in a little cluster with about a dozen other people and one individual who's at the head of the class, who's the critic, or however. And so, what is that actual? Is there a self-consciousness now about how we're going to structure this little organizational unit? Is the professor the master who will come and sort of sprinkle some fairy dust on everyone's desk or on their computer, or help them nudge something over on the screen?
No, therapist, definitely therapist.
Okay, so that's the model. It's sort of the analyst, the therapist, and so on, and what they're trying to get to. And midwife then becomes the other kind of metaphor. Or you sort of say, okay, we're self-consciously organizing ourselves as a unit. Maybe you sort of say, maybe we should practice what this thing called democracy is. And the role of the professor in there is to help facilitate a kind of a structuring of the knowledge acquisition mechanisms of the studio.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it somehow it triggered in me this thought too, that if actually we do probably need to build differently and build less, I think there's also a sort of deep question in terms of the way that we relate to the environment. When we're structuring our studios, what would it actually mean for us to? I mean, this is actually this is a design problem, but it's also a serious business problem. Mm-hmm. And the idea that we could kind of take on the design of less as a kind of conceptual construct, or the design of different, and pair it with something that's actually like incredibly pragmatic. Like, how would we go about doing architecture if we didn't have client-driven models in the way that we do right now? I mean, I think that's actually fascinating.
Well, it's sort of like practice as project, right? I mean, Stephen Cassell of like Architecture Research Office, I think here was talking a little bit about that, right? Like the idea that the practice becomes the project, but it's also a slippery slope, right? I think at the moment, practice and labor studies and you know, it's sexy, right? So there are a lot of firms that have even changed their name and adapted, you know, they rewrote their About Us section on their website. But it's sort of still business as usual. But like, you know, we have new firm names like Office of and Office of Office and Practice and the Practice of the Practice and the blah, you know, so it's just like, it's everywhere. And I think there's a danger in that it also means nothing, right? So like, how do we not lose that? And then also not lose interest in studies of labor and practice and exploitation and things when the economy gets a little bit better and we're like, oh, we don't have to focus on these questions anymore. So how do we continue to have these kind of conversations? Even when it feels less urgent, I guess, as a longer term project.
But, you know, it's interesting that the conversation from a pedagogical perspective is fascinating. Last several years, I've been teaching this course called Alternative Value Propositions of Practice. And I redesigned it and taught it like 4 different ways because I just can't get it right, apparently. But the thesis of the course is architects can do really important things. But it's not all about speculation. You have to go from some strategic vision to a business plan, to a thing that actually works as a mechanism. And I say, you can do whatever you want, but it has to have 2 characteristics. It has to be something architects do, and you cannot get paid by the hour. No time for money conversion. You can't sell time. You have to convert your value proposition in a business plan in some other way. And then I let them go nuts and do whatever they want. And for the last 4 or 5 years, it's been 5 years since I've seen an architecture practice proposed. Everybody's got lots of great ideas. This is my drone laser construction company. And this is one of my student teams did a brilliant job with a new residential sustainability certification system that combined all these different things. And I mean, it was brilliant, but it wasn't an architecture practice. So next year, there's going to be a 3rd rule. Next year, you have to design an architecture practice, and then we'll see how this goes. But it's just fascinating to me that these people, 97% of them say, I'm going to go get a job and I'm going to be a licensed architect. And at our school, everybody wants to start their own firm. Everybody checks those boxes. But when you give them a chance to work on that problem, they create a drone-based construction company. So I don't know. Maybe it's just an ethos thing, but it just seems strange to me.
I wonder, you know, we're talking a little bit about like values now. And so maybe returning one of your essay in the journal was value-based architecture in a profit-driven world. And, you know, you talked about the tensions between client-based services and sometimes, you know, the kind of urgent social, environmental, or cultural demands which fall outside of our contract. And so how do we as architects in a way, you know, how do we reconcile ourselves in those kinds of worlds when the client drives the project? But if we were to retrain the aim of design so that it can speak to some larger societal challenges, how can how do architects have to also change as well as the things that they make? I mean, there were some kind of threads here. Like I took some notes as you all were talking as like, you know, the act of designing and the act of making, 2 different things. What we make and how we make it, 2 different things, right? But they're kind of in overlapping spheres also. And one in a way continues to inform or reinform the other. So, you know, I think that, you know, when you look at the core values that are shared by NAB, by AIA, by ACSA, and NCARB, one of the things they talk about is knowledge and innovation, right? So the question that I have then is, you know, we think about, you know, the notion of advancing knowledge and innovation, it's risky experimentation, which we in schools have the luxury of doing that. It's a double-edged sword, right? So how might we shape our professional degree programs in a way to help students begin to understand how they skirt those lines and to think about how do they operate, you know, pursuing values-based architecture when there's so much pressure coming from, you know, client-driven projects. I want to look at one of my notes, like George I think that you mentioned, let's see, where is it? The dominant model today is that, private architectural practice is in service, to private wealth. But you offer these alternatives. The alternative models would be local architects working with cultural and ecological lessons of specific locales, a network of community architects engaged in participatory planning processes, public policy, like broadening this kind of the definition of the architect, which I'm very interested in. I mean, I find it so fascinating. And you go on to say that in this world, a greater number of architects would be able to instrumentalize public forms of power to affect a more democratic built environment. So if we think about that, and again, it's, returning back to some of the thoughts that were in the counterfactual architect, lessons from practice have the potential to inform other lessons. Recognizing the unfulfilled potential of lessons from the past can potentially affect the future.
What I say here might be seen as cynical or really not popular, but instead of saying, well, how can we better educate for this other model, maybe we just rename professional schools of architecture, schools of building design practice, and then sort of say give up on the title of architect. Try to change the state law so that the state can no longer regulate the term architect. Architect is like blueprint. It's like architect is the one with vision. Architect is the one with the big plan. Give up on trying to regulate who is an architect. Well, we can regulate the health, safety, building professional. That's really what it is that the state regulates, except it's tied to a name whose derivation is related to other systems of power. It has to do with the service of the king, the service of the pharaoh, the service of all these others, and who was at the right hand of the power and means and the vision, right? That's what the architect was. And so, but we maintain a kind of, I would sort of say, almost a monarchical kind of vision of what the architect is as a sort of, as an agent of power, wealth, and so on. Maybe that's the anachronism. But we never figured out what the process of design was, or we never really, within a dispersed democratic system. So maybe the person, the team coming up with the drone system, and that connects with this other one over there, which has to do with the kind of a procurement logistics and so on. And what we're doing now with AI is having the meta system that can coordinate all of those little sub specialties. What did you call them? Specialized?
Flexible specialties.
Flexible specialties that together in a kind of a dispersed democratic way constitute at the meta scale what we mean by architecture of democracy.
Interesting idea. I hope you're ready to teach in well, you've retired, but you guys are ready to teach that happens in much smaller schools of the built environment. I think that will, I'm going to take the contrarian view here and suggest that will unravel the entire structure of what we call the profession. And these questions will be dispersed into, and the teaching and research around these questions will be dispersed into more powerful parts of the university environment, for example. So our school, which is the humanities Ivy, has just decided to invest $4 billion in a school of engineering. They're going to get 10 new buildings, and they have 70 faculty positions they're going to hire. And if the School of Architecture weren't organized around a professional concept, almost everything that we did would be dispersed into that universe. and gone.
It's not just the professional. I mean, I think that architecture, naming it allows it also to be an intellectual project.
Yes.
So I think it's not just the professional project. I think it's actually the discipline. It's like, what's the core? I actually think it's like, what's the core of the discipline problem?
But I mean, if you look at a map of where all licensed architects live, I mean, we have like little clusters in urban areas, right? So thinking about like small town architect is almost an oxymoron.
Because that's what
Right.
did Jesse James say? Why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. They're architects in
Yeah,
those
of
cities because that's where the work is.
Of course. But I mean, thinking about like democratization, and you know, I taught for many years in New Mexico. In Navajo tradition, there's no such word or thing as an architect, right? So I think if we want to have broader questions and think about, you know, detaching ourselves from these royal traditions or these imperial traditions, I think we have to really come to terms with what the architect actually means, and who's included in that, right? And who do our institutions serve, right? If they're only based in these you know, urban areas, then yeah, big questions.
Yeah, no, and I do think this democratic question that's baked into your comments as well. I just want to like unroll that a little bit. What we ended up getting to in this counterfact, like the end. What's amazing, and this is a pedagogical technique too. I use this in studio. If you start the brief with a counterfactual, you know, like an alternate, how do you construct an alternative present? Then you're forced into confronting the real contingencies of our world in a very, very, very rigorous way. It's not purely speculative. I mean, it's actually it's speculative, but it's based upon a rigorous set of facts and real events. What we ended up getting to after we played out these events was actually, what did we call it? It was like the public architect, like basically that there would be a Department of Building at the United States if certain decisions had gone differently, you know, and we had realigned ourselves with different centers of power, we would have this Department of Building that would be responsible for standards and so on and so forth. But the public architect would actually have a role in sort of understanding the disposition of the built environment, that would be something that we would do, which makes a lot of sense to me, actually, still.
Well, but you know, it's a very interesting point, because when I was at Autodesk, I worked on the UK, it was called the Level 2 BIM standard. And the UK government at that time had a national construction strategy, because they said as an economy, we have a bunch of problems, which include, we have a lot of construction expertise that we can't deploy globally. We need to figure out how to do that. We have a carbon problem, and all the buildings that we build, and the government builds 40% of the buildings in the UK, are all desperately over budget and over schedule. And so they solved that by a kind of top-down construction strategy. And so they had this guy who, he's not there anymore because the governments have changed, but they have this guy called the Chief Construction Advisor to Her Majesty's government, who would be like the secretary of the building department that you're talking about. And they got an enormous amount of work done in about 4 or 5 years across the entire industry. I mean, just the BIM adoption alone, which is the thing I was working on, you know, in the States, it was like, oh, okay, we're going to take 20 years. We'll get to it. And in the UK, it was 4 years, because they decided this was how they were going to solve some of their problems. So it's, you know, maybe not such a bad idea. I mean, you know, I used to go to these AGC meetings, and, you know, I'd be the only left-leaning Democrat in the room. You know, it was all these contractors who were super right-wing guys, but they're like, yes, we need a government Department of Construction.
So I want to keep an eye on the time. It's almost 6 o'clock. I do want to maybe give time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience before we go. I know we realize we're standing between you and the food. So question right there. Wait for the microphone.
Firstly, I want to thank you guys for coming out here. It was a very interesting conversation. I think it's very needed. I have a very open-ended question. How would you say the growth and the evolution of building codes have affected the profession?
The growth? What do you mean by growth?
Like from the beginning there were not a lot of codes compared to today. So over time, they have grown as more programs are added, as technologies advance, there's more and more codes being added and evolving.
I think there are two things wrapped up in that. One is the way in which the building codes, let's say the quantity of constraints related to right, the way that code shapes architecture, and the other one is the quality in which it does so. Anne Louis from the University of Michigan is doing some really, really fascinating work on this. She's basically, in fact, she wrote an article in this issue called "Building Code as Battleground." And she's looking at and interrogating things like, gendered restrooms and the way that different lobbying groups in Chicago have historically shaped building code to benefit some of society and not others. So, I mean, I a little bit when I maybe an overcomplicated diagram, but when I was putting that up, there's like, gosh, we do actually, part of our role and responsibility is to not only take that code and operate with it, but like, these are like really heavy, chunky, like fatty path dependencies that have just been growing and accumulating, over so much time. We actually also need to, as a form of activism, act back on that as well. That's my take on that.
But George, you wrote about this in your essay, so can you comment on it?
Yeah. There's so many aspects of what we would point at as being negative constraints, but in the time they were progressive innovations, right? To try to actually take responsibility for things like the health, safety, and welfare of the public. So part and parcel of the kind of transformations that society was undergoing in transformation from a kind of an agriculture-based to an industrialized reality with concentrated metropolitan populations and the boom of building and the fact that we didn't want people, just to say, incinerated, but they're still happening, right? We can't, and now, right, what the folks in California have to examine is somewhere between their fire codes and their development standards and zoning and all of those kinds of things that they've got to figure out if they have the right set of controls and how to tweak them, and in terms of other things, or whether do we withdraw from certain places, take it out of development. So that's a part of a dynamic democratic process, because the professions and public stakeholders and so on participate in processes which are excruciatingly technical, but and we might sort of say one positive thing is that they are printed potentially, or they're in a PDF. They are accessible and available to us as a guiding logic.
Exactly.
That's unlike
everything
all those
else.
other codes that are hidden.
Right. It's explicit.
It's an explicit code, unlike computer code, which is hidden, or protocols or cultural codes that are embedded, that we have trouble navigating or acknowledging or so on. So,
but also, I will say, as a nerd and a licensed architect, I kind of like them, right? I like the problem-solving aspect of it. A lot of codes are prescriptive these days, like make this happen, which I like, and they also conflict, and so they don't. They're not completely descriptive about what you have to do. You have to exercise your judgment as a design professional, and that's what I do as an architect. So I actually
subject to interpretation.
Subject to interpretation, I'm going to convince this code official that the way I've thought about this problem works. I like that. I think that's kind of cool.
But it like a very basic level. I mean, I think it's important to say that building code, like the architect, fundamentally should be reflecting the needs of society at a given moment, and it has
Yes.
to change.
Agreed.
Maybe just as a last non-answer, the recent journal, the TAD journal, Technology, Architecture and Design journal, just had an edited issue about codes.
Coding, yeah.
Coding,
Yeah.
and there's some really excellent pieces in there that might interest you if codes are
Oh,
of interest.
I haven't opened that one yet.
Peggy, yeah.
Peggy. Oh, Peggy, of course. You know.
Thank you.
Get the last question.
Oh, boy.
No pressure.
Okay, I'll get right to it then.
Thank you. So David Yoakum, professor of practice. So this means a lot to me. And there were two things I wanted to talk about today. One was values and the other was power. And Julie, you started talking about values. I don't think it was answered yet. But Elizabeth, one thing that you did say in your essay, you said, does the role of the architect in society need to shift in order to create values-aligned change? It's kind of an obvious answer. The architect mission could consequently expand from the interest of private owners and mitigation of their many things, money, risk, blah, 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 to creating an architecture dedicated to democratic values such as equality, civic creativity, participation. So I ask, is that what architects are left doing? Are we just vessels of values? Because all the technical expertise is being taken over, right? All the training, look at what NAB's doing, right? It's a bit of fatalistic, but is that what we're left doing? Are we like Columbia floating over the landscape saying, yes, we should do this. No, we should not do this. We can tell you what is right because everything else technical is left. I don't think so, but I'm asking the question because I think some of the essays have broached that. The second thing has to do with power. Values are beliefs that are personal and they're debatable. In fact, even ethics are debatable these days. What's right, what's wrong. But without power, something at which architects are notoriously ineffectual and nervous about collecting and wielding, we're awful at it as a discipline. How do we have the leverage to make the changes based on the values that we believe are not just important, but critical? So my question is, where's the power in practice?
You want to take the values one?
Okay, so I'll take the values one.
I'll take the power one, and you're not going to like my
I'll
answer.
put them together.
No, I think this question of technical skill maybe needs to be pulled apart a little bit. Like, things that humans are good at and things that computers are good at. Things that computers are good at are solving the problems that Phil's talking about, actually, which is the building code problem, I think.
Within limits.
Increasingly good. Things that humans are good at are translating meaning into the disciplinary skills and techniques that are essential to us. Like, what is space? How is space bounded? How do we think about spatial relationships in a way that is relevant to a set of programmatic or other criteria that we need right now? And I think those are really, really different things. I don't think that's a computer problem. I think that's a human problem. So I think if we pull apart what is not only our value, but also what is our actual technical skill, then we can get at that issue a little bit. Does that seem like it answers that question?
No. But Phil?
Phil?
No, there's a lot of food out there. There's a lot to talk about. But
Well, I was
But I
just say, I'm curious about the power issue, but
yeah,
I
I
was
want to hear the power.
But just say that I think it's an important question for people in this room, for people in this city, in this country, maybe internationally. How do we want to live together? And so, and at one level, that has to be a spatial, architectural, environmental question. How do we want to live together? And that somehow the way that is effectuated has consequences. And I don't know. So, I mean, when you sort of say we're getting at issues of what the core knowledge is, or what the core is, that somehow there has to be an understanding in what we do of what it means about how what we do matters relative to how we live together.
I mean, I sort of see these as one. And I think for me, maybe one of the ways to change value, if we have a conversation about values, how do then you start to adopt those values? It's really through organization and organizing oftentimes. And to me, that's what architects do. I mean, the expertise is really in organizing and organization. So, there are so many conversations about how do you sort of, topple power structures from the bottom up. And it's really like putting people together. There's solidarity and numbers and bodies and things. But if you really think about what that work entails, it's architectural work, right? Really thinking about designing, a system of toppling power, for example. And one of the things that has struck me is we're not very good at putting those things together, or thinking about like using our tools for change.
Yeah. Like friend Scott Simpson says, architects are great at inflicting change on everybody but themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago when the union drive failed at Shop Architects, I interviewed a couple of the union busters who changed their mind. They were supporting the union, and then they said at the very last minute, they said no. And they got a lot of, shit for this. And it was a very unpopular opinion. So I was curious, like, what happened? Why did you all of a sudden change your mind? And they said, you know what? We were all on board. Everyone wants the union, but the organizers had no idea about what it is that an architect does and how architecture works. And so I think it's really, you got to put the two of those things together. Like, what's the expertise? And then how do you then organize to actually change power systems and also really create new value systems? So yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, now I'm going to give a response around power that's diagonally opposite from my colleague Aaron here.
I'm an assistant professor here.
Right.
That's the dean.
That's the dean, yeah. Old guy, new guy, and former board member of the union, I might add, but
Right,
that's a whole other discussion.
Yes.
Oh yeah. The source of my anxiety about what George was intimating about the delamination of the term architect is, at the end of the day, the power that we have in these larger systems is the legal requirement that it's somebody who's called an architect is involved in the building of a building. And when my students say, oh, I don't want to take the test, or I don't want to study for the ARE, it's a very simple equation. I don't care how stupid you think the test is. I don't care how painful you think the process of the AXP is. This is a power discussion. The only leverage we have is that legal lever. You may not like the way it works or the way it's shaped, but that's the fulcrum point. And when we give that up and disperse our pedagogy and our intellectual capital into the other parts of the control system, we're done, in my opinion. We're completely done, which is why this competency stuff and all the crap going on with NAB and the incredible lack of presence of any leadership from the AIA makes me crazy, because that we got to, you have to fight the system with what the leverage that you have, and we ain't got much. There aren't very many of us. We don't have a lot of lobbyists. We don't have any power. As far as I know, the last member of the U.S. Congress who was an architect was my college suite mate, Richard Sweat. That was 1994. We don't have much leverage. Let's not burn what little leverage we have.
Yeah, we have the stamp.
We have the stamp.
But to the counterfactual point, I mean, to go back 1899 or 1898, whatever it was, when licensure was approved by the government in Illinois first, right? They tried and the government said, no, Congress said, no, 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 like this shouldn't be a licensed profession. They tried many times. And then there was an architect politician on the inside who sponsored the bill and said, okay, now you can be licensed. So I mean,
well, democracy sucks. I mean, what do you got? I mean, it's a democracy.
but I'm just saying, you know, like the political insider knowing the system.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, that's how it works. I mean, so I've been teaching with a colleague from Michigan a course on enforced labor in the building industry, like slavery in the building industry. And every semester, we taught this course 4 years in a row. Every semester, our students go through what Lou and I call the Valley of Despair. And the Valley of Despair is like 4 weeks into the semester when they've really understood the breadth of the problem and how terrible it is. They're really depressed, and they all collectively say, the only way we can solve this problem is to destroy capitalism. We're like, okay, that's very, very interesting idea. We should explore that, probably in another classroom, because this class is about what architects can do to solve this problem in the modern supply chain. So there's theory and there's practice. And when we don't have licenses anymore, there won't be either, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's one maybe addition here to the in the conversation with Daniel Suskind that we've been talking about with the AMA, the president of the AMA, AIA, and ABA. The AMA president and ABA president were like, oh yeah, well, when we need to, you know, make changes, we obviously just go to Washington and we lobby and we do these things, and you know, we spend a lot of money on this. And the AIA was like, oh.
So what a great conversation this afternoon. I learned a lot listening to all four of you. I really enjoyed the conversation. I want to thank Phil Bernstein, Aaron Cayer, and Elizabeth Cristoforetti for flying in from various parts. I was so nervous that the weather was going to affect flights coming in, but I'm very happy.
Yeah, that quarter inch of snow really screwed things up.
It wasn't even a quarter inch, I don't think. But most of all, I'm really thrilled that we were able to all come together in honor of George, my colleague, my friend. I keep you on my speed dial. So that's tremendous. I mean, the impact that you had, it's really incredible. It's really remarkable. And to hear from Phil and Aaron, Elizabeth, as they reference the work and the arc of your work, and then to hear you speak about the next project that you're working on, it's really tremendous. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.